Hey guys, welcome back to Triple L Rustic Designs. In today's video, I'm going to take a couple of our live edge slabs and using some epoxy and chains, I'm going to make this one-of-a-kind 12-foot epoxy river conference table. Stick around to see how it's done. To begin this project, we're going to start out at our local Lowe's home improvement store. We need to get supplies to build ourselves a 12-foot by 3-foot epoxy mold. One of the best materials for making these molds is these 4-foot by 8-foot sheets of melamine. Now I would recommend taking a friend along with you to Lowe's because it is a lot easier to load these sheets of melamine with a second person instead of by yourself. Now that we have our melamine, we need to head down to the paint supplies section where we're going to pick up some epoxy mixing buckets and some silicone. Lowe's sells these 5-gallon mixing buckets that have measurements on the outside, so we're going to grab a couple of those, and then we need to get some all-purpose silicone for sealing the cracks in the mold. Now that we have some of the supplies that we'll need, it's time to load everything up and head back to the shop where we will begin our project. So being that this table is going to be 12 foot by 3 foot, we need to have a good working table. So we ended up clamping 2 of our 6-foot rolling tables together, and then using some 2x4s, we laid them across both tables, creating one solid platform for the melamine sheets to sit on. To cut our sheets of melamine down to the proper size, we used our Festool TS75 track saw. The track saw produces really accurate cuts, and it was a lot easier than trying to run these 4-foot by 8-foot sheets of melamine through our table saw. So the final dimensions of the finished table needs to be 12 foot by 3 foot. So I'm going to build this epoxy mold just a little bit larger by adding 2 inches on both the length and the width, and then in the end I will cut the finished table down to the proper size. Now that I have the 2 bottom pieces of the melamine cut to the proper size, I decided to silicone the joint between the 2 pieces and then use some clamps to hold them together until the silicone cured. While that silicone was curing, I went ahead and started cutting the side pieces for the epoxy mold. I cut most of these pieces using the track saw, but once it became too difficult to clamp the track down to the piece, I did end up taking it inside and running it through our table saw. Now with us offering slab flattening services to the public, we get to see a lot of epoxy mistakes come in. A lot of people are mistaken and believe that if you buy this melamine, you don't need to use epoxy tape on the melamine, that you can just go ahead and pour the epoxy right on top of the melamine. I'm here to tell you that yes, that may work sometimes, but it is much safer to head over to Bidwell Wood and Iron, pick yourself up some of this epoxy tape, and tape the entire mold first. Every week we have customers come into the shop with their epoxy projects to be flattened, and you wouldn't believe how many times there's melamine completely bonded to the epoxy project because they did not tape the melamine first. I'm telling you right now, just go ahead, buy yourself a couple rolls of this epoxy tape, take the extra time and tape the mold, and you will have a much cleaner release process when you go to take the project out of the mold. Now it's time to put on the sidewalls of the epoxy mold. I did tape those as well, and then I just worked my way around pre-drilling all the holes. For now, I did screw the sidewalls onto the mold, but I will take them back off, apply some silicone, and then put them back on before we're ready to pour. It's very important you pay close attention to applying these sidewalls with the silicone and the epoxy tape because you don't want all the epoxy to leak out. Epoxy is very expensive, and a 12-foot table has somewhere close to $3,000 in epoxy in it, so you don't want that leaking out of the mold and onto the floor. Now that our mold is complete, it's time to build a frame so that we can get a good idea of how we want to lay out the slabs inside the mold. If you're planning to build an epoxy project like this, I would highly encourage you to build a frame like this so that you can get the idea of how you want to lay out the slabs inside the project and see how it looks. Being that we do own a sawmill and we cut and dry our own slabs and then offer those for sale to the public, we often do this for customers when they come in to look at some slabs. It's hard to picture the idea of the project without seeing it in a frame like this. So I have a couple frames sitting around the shop, and when customers come in and they just can't quite picture the project, I throw a frame down and it usually sells them every time. Now that we have our slabs marked where we need to make our cuts, we're going to take them outside, and using our track saw, we're going to make some nice clean cuts, cutting them down to the proper size to fit in the epoxy mold. After that, I use a cordless grinder and I just clean up that face of that live edge so that the epoxy has a good wood surface to bond to. Our slabs are looking great, and if you're wondering what kind of wood species this is actually monkey puzzle, and these slabs were cut in a YouTube video on our channel. That video has 2.3 million views, and I highly encourage you to check it out. The last thing we need to do is flatten both of these slabs so that they are the exact same thickness and that they are perfectly flat. So we threw them up on our Wood Miser slab miser, took a little bit off the top and bottom, and now they're ready to go into the mold. Like I said earlier, I took all the side pieces off and I applied a bead of silicone between the bottom and the sides, and then screwed the side pieces back on and then applied a bead of silicone to the crack on the inside of the mold as well. Next, we can go ahead and put our slabs inside the mold, and then we're going to let that silicone cure for 24 hours before we mix up any epoxy. While the silicone is curing, it's time to start brainstorming how we're going to lay out the chain that the client wants running through the middle of the table. These toe chains originally came around 10 feet long. Well, we knew that we were going to have to cut them down to fit inside the mold, but I wanted to keep those toe accessories on the end. So we're going to have to break out the angle grinder and the welder and do some metal fabrication to the chains. After cutting the chain down to the perfect length and cutting the accessories off the end, it was time to weld them back onto the chain as if nothing happened. To do that, we're going to break out our handy little Rilon stick welder. If you guys are in the market for a really nice compact welder to have around your shop, these Rilon stick welders are pretty affordable and they produce great results. I was actually blown away at how easy it is to use in its compact size, but I've been very impressed with it. So if you guys are interested in checking them out, I will have a link in the description below. Now that we have the toe accessories welded back onto the chain, there's still one more thing we need to do to the chain to make it work inside of our table project. So the rings that connect the chain to the toe hooks, they sit too tall in the river of the table. It would cause these rings to stick up past the level of the wood, which in the end would either have a ring sticking out of the top of the table, but it also prevents us from flattening the table. So what I'm doing is using the angle grinder to grind the bottom of those rings about a ½ inch, and that's going to put those rings down below the surface of the wood and make our project perfect. So all of the epoxy that we're going to use in this video is from the company SuperClear. If you guys don't know, SuperClear makes some of the best epoxy on the market, and it is the only epoxy we use now at L Rustic Designs. We are also a distributor of SuperClear Epoxy, so if you guys are ever in the market for some epoxy, you can head over to tlrds.com and order some SuperClear Epoxy straight off of our website, and we will get it shipped out to you usually the same day or the next day. If you don't feel like ordering the epoxy from us, you can order it directly from SuperClear. I have some affiliate links in the description below where you can find all the products that SuperClear has to offer and order whatever you'd like. For this first layer of blue epoxy in the bottom of this table, we are using the SuperClear Art Resin. The Art Resin is our go-to epoxy when pouring thin color layers like we're doing on the bottom of this table. It's a 1-to-1 ratio, and it sets up in about an hour and a half. So at that hour and a half mark, you're able to trap in the swirls, and then you can let it cure overnight and come back and keep working on the project the next day. This art resin is good for pours up to a 1/4 inch thick. Now, as if this project wasn't stressful enough, right when we were about to pour our first layer of epoxy, our brand new GoPro Hero 10 falls off the top of this 8-foot ladder and completely shatters. It still worked throughout this build, but I do have to send this back to GoPro and get a new one. Now that we're back in action, it's time to pour our first layer of blue epoxy in the bottom of this river. As you can see there, Dad's pouring while I'm shooting some Instagram content, and he's actually pouring 60 ounces in this first pour. This blue layer on the bottom of this river is going to take 180 ounces of epoxy. Instead of mixing it all up at once and risking having an overheating disaster, I mixed it up in 3 different 60-ounce buckets. I've learned from enough epoxy failures that were created by myself that it's better to play it safe. So instead of mixing all that up into one giant bucket, I mixed up 3 different 60-ounce buckets, poured them in, as you can see here, working my way down the table, and then we just needed to wait till that hour and a half mark where we could trap in the swirls. You'll see here I repeatedly apply the swirls to the epoxy even though the exothermic reaction gets rid of them. It's my way of continuously checking the epoxy to see if it's ready to trap in the swirls. Once the epoxy has the consistency of like really thick maple syrup or honey, it is ready to trap the swirls, so you will apply your final layer of swirls and let it sit. After letting the epoxy cure overnight, it is now time to lay out our chain inside the river. I go along and check and make sure that all parts of the chain are sitting below the level of the wood, and then I remove the chain, sand that blue layer with some 220 grit sandpaper, and then apply the chain back into the river and get ready to pour our first layer of clear epoxy. For the clear layers of epoxy in this river table, we're using SuperClear liquid glass. This is their deep pour epoxy that you can pour 2 to 4 inches thick. However, I always recommend just pouring it in thin layers. Not everybody has a perfectly controlled environment, and if you go and pour 4 inches thick of epoxy and you made one mistake, you just ruined basically all of that epoxy. So mix it up in shallow layers, maybe like an inch thick or even up to 2 inches thick. Make sure that that layer of epoxy cures correctly, and then just keep working your way to the top. It's better to play it safe than to try and rush it and ruin all of your epoxy. So for those of you that want to keep track, the blue SuperClear art resin there on the bottom of this river was 1.5 gallons. Now for the clear epoxy, the SuperClear liquid glass, in the end, we are going to use a total of 17 gallons. Now, I'm no mathematician, but a 3-gallon kit of SuperClear epoxy at full price is $300. So we're at roughly $1,800 worth of epoxy already, not even including what we have to use to finish this project. So like I mentioned before, I'm just slowly working my way to the top of this table, pouring about 1-inch thick layers of clear epoxy each time. As you can see there, that clear epoxy has some bubbles in it and it's flowing down the chain there to the end of the table. But don't worry, this super clear epoxy has such a great viscosity that the bubbles usually rise to the surface and pop themselves, or you can use the heat torch to pop them right away. So here we are pouring the last 2 layers of the SuperClear liquid glass. As you can tell by the shirt changes, I'm pouring a layer of clear epoxy, letting it cure overnight, coming back the next day while it was still tacky, pouring another layer, and just keep doing that until we get to the surface of the wood. After letting the epoxy cure for a couple days, I came back and removed the sidewalls of the mold so that I can get the sander and begin sanding all those blue spots of epoxy off of the knots on the table. Ideally, I would have just put the entire table on the slab flattening machine and flattened it all down, but because those rings on the tow hooks were so close to the surface, I couldn't risk it, so I had to sand all the extra epoxy by hand. Now that all those knots are sanded smooth, it's time to take some 220 grit sandpaper and scuff the clear part of the table. I know it's kind of crazy seeing it go from so beautiful to getting all scuffed up, but don't worry, we will make it nice and pretty in the end. I decided I'm going to pour some clear epoxy on top of the table to build up its thickness, so I go ahead and apply some silicone and put the side pieces back on the mold. The clear epoxy that I'm going to use to build up the thickness is the brand new SuperClear countertop epoxy. And this was my first time ever using this, and I was extremely impressed. This is kind of like their tabletop epoxy, but it's a 2-to-1 ratio, so it gives you a little bit longer working time and a longer curing time. Now here's where I'm making a very expensive mistake. As you can see, I'm pouring that epoxy right onto the top of the raw wood. Well, you always see those debates about should you seal your wood first. And in this case, yes, I should have sealed the wood first by painting on some epoxy before doing this method. What ends up happening is by me pouring all this epoxy on top of the wood, thousands of little microbubbles come out of the wood and they slowly drifted across above the chain in the river, making them super visible and making it almost look like the river was kind of cloudy. Now, most people wouldn't have noticed this, and some people probably wouldn't have cared, but this is a very expensive table, and I want our clients to be really happy with it. So I had to make the tough decision to put this table up on our flattening machine and completely delete all that epoxy that I just put onto the top. It was about 1/8 inch thick of that super clear countertop, and I just basically deleted all of it by flattening it off the table and pretty much just throwing away about $800 worth of epoxy. I want to be clear and make sure you know that this was not the epoxy's fault. This was my fault for not sealing the wood first. Lessons learned, but if you're watching this video, make sure you seal your wood before pouring clear epoxy on top of it, because microbubbles will come out and you will see them. After flattening the top of the table pretty much back down to the wood, it was time to flip it over and flatten the bottom. As you can see there, some of the blue epoxy crept through to the bottom of the slab, but that's okay, we're going to flatten it all back down. Being that that blue layer of epoxy was only about 1/4 inch thick, I wasn't able to flatten the entire bottom completely, or else I would have started deleting that blue layer of epoxy and then the table would have been transparent. Not only that, I didn't want to hit the chain that was just on the other side of that blue epoxy. We ended up moving the table back inside the shop where I was able to sand off that remaining epoxy and get it ready for the next step. Being that I couldn't completely flatten the underside of the table, I decided I'm going to use some epoxy to level out the low areas. So the first step is sealing the wood. So I'm using some SuperClear Deep Pour 24 to work my way around the table, sealing all the wood. The next morning, while that epoxy was still a little bit tacky, I poured another 1.5 gallons of that SuperClear Deep Pour 24, and then I just used my hands to spread it all around the table, trying to level it out the best that I could. So the bottom of the table is looking pretty good with that flood coat, but I did notice that there was still some low areas after the epoxy cured, so I decided to sand the entire surface with some 220 grit sandpaper, and then poured another 1.5 gallons of that SuperClear Deep Pour 24, which leveled out the bottom of the table, and I think we're finally finished. So we're going to let this cure for a couple days and then start working on our hardware. At this point, the customer was still undecided on what style legs they wanted on the table, so I threw up 3 different styles: an X style, a U shape, and a trestle style. Sent them some pictures and they decided to go with the X-shaped legs. For this build, I'm going to be testing out some new C-channel from the company Bidwell Wood and Iron. This is a brand new product that just hit the market. I will explain more about it here in a little bit, but now we need to get all the hardware off the table and we're going to start making our straight edge cuts, cutting the table down to the proper size. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove the side walls of the mold, and once I get those out of place, then I need to pop the table loose from the bottom of the mold, and then using the Festool TS75 track saw, we're going to cut some straight edges on this table. The Festool produces really accurate cuts, but as always, you have to make multiple passes, especially with this epoxy. It's a shame that such an expensive saw is so underpowered, but it does produce accurate cuts, so it's a love-hate relationship. Now that we have the table cut down to our final size, which is 12 feet long by 36 inches wide, it's time to tape up the edges of the table so that we can break out our router. And we're going to be applying a nice little 45-degree chamfer to both the top and the bottom of this table. Now that we have our edge all routed, it's time to clean everything up and get ready to install our table legs and our C-channel. Since this is a big 12-foot conference table, we are going with 3 legs on this build so that there's support in the middle of the table. So I've got those end legs positioned about 12 inches in from the end of the table, and then I split the difference between both legs for that middle set of legs. Everything is laid out pretty much exactly where it needs to be mounted. So we're going to do a walk around the table, make sure everything looks good, and then we can start marking the locations so that we can install all the hardware. So the C-channel that we're going to be using on this table is called Micro C-channel from Bidwell Wood and Iron. Typically, C-channel is mounted where the legs of the C-channel are pointing down into the wood. In this case, I could not use C-channel that way because if I was to route out the grooves for the C-channel to go down into the wood, it would go past that blue epoxy and hit the chain on the other side. So we couldn't do that. So this way, using this Micro C-channel, we're able to mount it upside down where the legs are pointing down towards like the floor. And that way I don't have to cut that groove into the bottom of the table and into the epoxy, possibly hitting the chain. With the legs being only about an 1/8 inch deep and having that tapered edge on the end, when the table's right side up, you almost would never see it unless you got down on the floor to look up under the table. So it's going to give that sturdiness and the rigidity to the table, helping keep it perfectly flat, but then it's also going to be hidden so you'd never know it's there. To mount the C-channel, I use a punch to mark the spots where I need to drill out. Then I use a $7 drill block and a drill to create my holes, and then a countersink bit to widen the holes, and then I insert the threaded inserts so that we can secure the C-channel properly. I'm kind of rushing through the installation process of the C-channel in this video, but I do have another video that shows the full process of installing C-channel. I do, however, want to emphasize that this micro C-channel from Bidwell Wood and Iron was an absolute game changer. It is exactly what I needed for this table because I could not afford to inset C-channel into the wood. So if you guys have any kind of like river table like this or a very thin table, I highly recommend you head over to Bidwell Wood and Iron, pick yourself up some of this micro C-channel, and always ensure that your table stays nice and flat. If you guys like these X-style metal legs used in this video, I highly recommend them. I have a link in the description below, but they're from the company Rustic Design Canada. They come pre-drilled with all the holes to install them onto the table, and they even come with adjustable feet on the bottom, which is huge because nobody's house is perfectly flat, so having those adjustable feet is a game changer. We're really happy with them. You should go check them out. So now that the bottom is finished, I took the legs off the table and we're going to try and flip it over, just me and Dad. This tabletop weighs approximately 300 pounds, so moving it or flipping it is extremely scary and it is quite difficult, but we are able to stand it up, and then we go over to the other side and gently lay it down on those C-channel so that we can start working the top side of the table. This is where I was really glad to have that C-channel installed, because flipping a table this heavy and this big with that river in the middle could have been extremely scary, but since the C-channel was in there, I felt confident that it wasn't going to break. The top side of the table did have some epoxy come through some of those holes, so we're going to have to sand everything down nice and flat, and then we can start working it, finishing the top of this table. It's always so crazy to me to see what the epoxy project looks like before you either apply a flood coat or polish it. As you can see, that clear epoxy is very cloudy right now. You can almost not see the chain, but don't worry, this thing is going to be awesome once we finish it. So I first sanded the top of the table with some 120 grit, making it nice and flat, then applied that 45-degree chamfer to the edges, and then finished sanding the entire table all the way up to 220 grit. And then using some SuperClear tabletop epoxy, I used my hand and applied a seal coat to the wood, and then we'll let that cure overnight. The next day, once that tabletop epoxy had cured, I used my SurfPrep sander and I sanded the surface, making everything nice and flat and smooth so that we could now apply a flood coat. To flood coat this table, we're going to be using the SuperClear tabletop epoxy. I did try something new, and I broke out a paint roller and I tried rolling this tabletop epoxy across this table. In the end, I think it was just too thick of an epoxy to effectively roll it. It was just leaving like a orange peel type texture. So in the end, I ended up just dumping the rest of that tabletop epoxy on the table and using my hand with a glove to spread it around and make it nice and even. I quickly realized that 60 ounces was not enough, so I mixed up another 60 ounces of that tabletop epoxy, poured it on top of the table, and spread it around with my hand, just leveling everything out so that that epoxy self-leveled around the whole table, providing a nice even coat. As you can see, the table is looking really, really good, but there was still a bunch of little dimples and areas that I was not pleased with. So I knew I was going to have to take this table off and flood coat it the proper way by pouring probably around 6 gallons worth of epoxy on top of the table, letting it just pour off the sides and flood the entire thing. But that way it would self-level and create this perfect glass-like finish. To do that, once again, we're going to have to sand the entire surface, making everything nice and flat and smooth before we can apply that final flood coat. So I'm using my SurfPrep sander, working my way around the table, just smoothing everything out, getting the surface ready. For those of you watching this, this is why a flood coat epoxy job costs a lot more than like a matte finish, like an oil finish or a spray finish, because there is a lot more work that goes into it. So as you can see here, we're taking this 300-pound tabletop and moving it over to some sawhorses, and we have some plastic underneath, so that way we can protect the garage floor from all the epoxy drips whenever it drips off the edges. Using some alcohol and a rag, I clean all the debris off the surface, and then using a level, I just make sure the table is level in all directions so that when we put the epoxy on, it flows evenly across the whole table, creating a perfect finish. For this flood coat, I'm mixing up about 3 gallons of this tabletop epoxy and just getting it all mixed thoroughly. This is very important. This is the last step, so we're going to mix it very thoroughly, make sure it's all mixed well, and then get ready to pour. You'll see I just pour all that epoxy right down the middle of the table, working my way all the way to the end, trying to spread the epoxy as evenly as possible across the table. And then once it's all poured out onto the table, I will use my hands to spread it all around the table and try to get it as even as possible. The epoxy will self-level, but you want to spread it around evenly so that every part of the table is covered. Once every part of the table has epoxy on it, that epoxy will work together with itself and self-level, running over the edges of the table, dripping onto the floor, creating this perfectly flat finish. Now it's important to monitor the table and pop any air bubbles while you have the chance. This epoxy is thick and it starts to set up pretty quick, and you don't want air bubbles trapped inside. The table is looking pretty awesome, so our goal is to keep all the bugs and any dust out of it overnight while it cures so that we get a perfect finish. You can see here from an angle that by pouring all that epoxy on there, letting it just run over the edges, it self-levels across the top, creating that glass-like finish. Well, here we are the next day, and as you can see, that flood coat turned out perfect. We have a nice, flawless finish on top of this table. It is extremely glossy, as you can see all the reflection of the lights there, but a nice, perfect finish. No dust, no bugs. It worked out really good. So now we need to let this set up for at least 4 or 5 days, and then we're going to sand the drips off the bottom of the table. Getting to this point in the build was quite relieving. We're pretty much at the final step. We just have a couple more things to do before we get this table delivered to the clients, but I think they're going to love it. So after a couple days of the epoxy curing, I decided I was going to apply a ceramic coating to the top. This ceramic coating applies on as like a liquid film, and as it hardens over 24 hours, it creates a very hard, waterproof, scratch-proof layer to the top of the table. The epoxy itself is very durable and waterproof, but it can be prone to some scratches, so adding a ceramic layer adds that next layer of protection to the table. After letting that ceramic coating harden for 24 hours, it's now time to set up the table to sand off the drips on the bottom of the table. Since I was not taking any chances flipping this table over and putting weight on the tabletop, I sanded a few of the drips and then got the legs installed back on the under of the table, and then removed the sawhorses so I could work my way around the entire table, sanding away all the drips. Once all the drips were sanded away, I used some towels and alcohol to clean up all the debris, and then I used some atomic oil and applied that to the areas that I sanded, making a nice finish on the bottom of the table. And finally, the table is complete. It took a little over 5 weeks to build this table. It could have been done in less time, but fighting the thickness of those chains and all those struggles that we went through made it take a little bit longer than expected, but in the end, it turned out absolutely beautiful. Just to recap, this wood is Monkey Puzzle, and it was cut in a video on our channel that has 2.3 million views. All of the epoxy in this video, it was provided by SuperClear Epoxy. If you guys are interested in purchasing any SuperClear Epoxy, we will have links in the description below. It is the best epoxy on the market in our opinion, and we absolutely love using it. The pigment that you see there in that blue layer of epoxy is from the company Eye Candy Pigments. The metal legs on the bottom of the table are from the company Rustic Design Canada. The C channel is provided by the company Bidwell Wood and Iron. I will have links to all these companies and their products in the description below this video. I just love the way this table turned out. As you can see, the clarity is unreal. You can see that live edge of the wood there. There's absolutely no bubbles. There's no flaws. This table turned out so great, but it took a lot of work to get here. Now, we normally don't do this, but we agreed to deliver this table to the customer, so it's time to get it packaged up and ready for delivery. Now, being that we've put so much hard work and effort into this table and it was in such great condition, I did not want to risk having anything happen to it during delivery. So I wrapped that baby up tighter than a Taco Bell burrito using some foam and then some shrink wrap. We got the entire top wrapped up and then removed the legs so that we can transport it. And then our plans were to reinstall the legs in place once we get to the customer's business. Now, in case you couldn't tell from the toe chains inside the table, this table was built for one of the best tow companies in the Central Florida area, and that is Brewington's Towing. Brewington's was nice enough to send over a flatbed tow truck and 2 of their guys to help us lift this 300-pound tabletop onto the back of the tow truck so that we didn't have to try and cram it into the back of a truck or put it on the trailer. This was just way easier to tow it to the facility on the back of a flatbed tow truck. Now that the table is all strapped down, it's time to load up and head over to the Brewington shop, get this table inside and delivered, and see their reaction. I'm gonna start pulling back. I need 2 guys to get in here. Actually, 3 guys to get in this side. So, sliding. All right, now as it starts going, yeah, you carry, yep, and now another one get in there. Yep, and then one more is gonna get in there.
Oh, it ain't bad with this one.
Yeah. Okay, you got it, sir?
1, 2, 3.
All right, good. Now spin. Okay.
And y'all pick up towards us.
Okay, yeah, keep spinning, keep spinning. Okay, and now we start, you guys lift, you guys drop. Left side lift, right side drop, and then we need to get it vertical up on this thing. Perfect.
Hold on.
Yeah, all right, watch your fingers.
No, lift up.
Yep. Get that card under there. Get that card under there. Good. Take the end right here.
You're gonna have to lift on there.
All right. Good. Oh, hold on.
Okay.
All right. There's not much on that back.
Yeah. All right, and then kick it around, Jason.
Away from the wall.
Okay. All right. Okay, just
1, 2,
3. Okay. All right, and now it's coming to you guys, DJ and Dad. Okay, you guys got your side? And then just back into here. Good.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, guys. Just go up and then over. And then go straight down. All right. Up. And then
needs to come this way a little bit, doesn't it?
towards you?
Yeah.
Okay.
You good?
Well, yeah, go down, straight down. Ready? Yeah. Hey. Here, fold this stuff. Nice.
That was good, Trey.
Heck yeah, man. Stressful.
I bet.
Now the only problem is hopefully you don't want the hooks facing this way.
No, actually one of them.
Okay, good. Well, there you have it, guys. The table is successfully delivered to the Brewington's operation. Like I said, Brewington's is one of the best towing companies in the Central Florida area. If you guys are in need of any kind of tow services, I highly recommend you reach out to Brewington's. They're a great family-owned company, and they're really great people. I just love the way this project turned out, and even though it was a very stressful 5 weeks working on this project, it turned out great, and I'm really glad that we did it. This was my first time ever incorporating tow chains or any kind of chains into an epoxy table, but it turned out really cool, and I'll definitely be making some more in the future. If you guys enjoyed this video, let me know what you thought about it in the comment section down below. How do you think that the table turned out? What would you have done differently? What did you like that I did? I'd love to hear your advice about this build. So anything you've got to say, drop it in the comment section down below. I read every single one of the comments, and if you put a good comment, I usually respond back to you. So I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say. As if I didn't say it enough, all the epoxy in this giant epoxy table is from the company SuperClear. We love SuperClear products, and the epoxy turned out great. If you guys are in the market for a custom epoxy table or even a non-epoxy table, just a live edge style table, I highly encourage you to reach out to us. We are now accepting custom orders for tables like this. We still are selective on which projects we take on because our YouTube channel is still our primary focus, so we can only take on so many projects before we start neglecting the YouTube channel. If you guys enjoyed this video, as always, please smash that like button and make sure you are subscribed to our channel so you don't miss any of our future videos. Guys, that is going to wrap it up. I sure hope you enjoyed this video. We will definitely see you on the next one.